August 1945. The Pacific War is ending, but the air still tastes of ash and surrender. On the docks of Guam, a group of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and radio operators step hesitantly off a transport ship. Their uniforms are torn, their eyes fixed to the ground. Each one expects the same fate they've been warned about for years: humiliation, torture, perhaps worse. They have seen the American leaflets, drawings of devils in helmets. They believe this is the end, but as the guards call them forward, the scene fractures expectation. No shouting, no rifle butts, only an American sergeant motioning toward a tent and handing them tin mugs filled with something steaming. Coffee. Real coffee. The women freeze, uncertain whether this is a trick. One smells the liquid, another, trembling, takes a sip. The warmth hits her throat, and for the first time since Saipan fell, she exhales. For these women, captivity was supposed to be hell. Instead, it felt like stepping into a world they'd been told could not exist. By mid-1945, Japan was collapsing. The Pacific Ocean, once envisioned as the empire's protective moat, had become a graveyard of ships, steel, and ambition. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, every island had cost the Imperial Army tens of thousands of lives. The home islands faced relentless bombing. Food was scarce, morale shattered, and surrender, a word forbidden in Tokyo, had become inevitable on the battlefield. Amid this collapse, thousands of Japanese personnel, including women, were captured across the Pacific. Many were not combatants. They were nurses attached to frontline hospitals, communication clerks stationed on captured islands, and civilian auxiliaries caught in the chaos of retreat. To the Japanese mind, the concept of surrender itself was unthinkable, a stain on honor, a living death. Soldiers were told that Allied forces mutilated captives. Women were told far worse. Propaganda burned these ideas into every heart. Americans were monsters. Yet when the war reached its breaking point, reality diverged from myth. On islands like Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, small groups of Japanese women were captured alive, a rarity in a war where suicide was often seen as preferable to dishonor. American troops trained for combat found themselves face-to-face with terrified prisoners who expected brutality. Instead, they met silence, confusion, and broken humanity. The U.S. military's approach to prisoners, including women, was guided by policy and pragmatism. The War Department had issued clear directives under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war, regardless of nationality or gender, were to be treated humanely. America's image as a moral power hinged on that compliance. With propaganda warfare in full swing, the way it treated enemy POWs mattered as much as any victory on the battlefield. But there was more at play than policy. Many American officers, themselves exhausted by the Pacific Campaign's carnage, viewed humane treatment as a statement, a quiet moral retaliation against Japanese atrocities in Bataan, Nanking, and countless unnamed villages. In their minds, showing mercy was its own form of victory. When the first female Japanese POWs arrived in American custody, they were processed like any other prisoner group, disarmed, recorded, medically examined. But from there, the script diverged dramatically. Instead of squalid cells or forced labor, they were taken to facilities that, while heavily guarded, resembled orderly, clean camps, small towns within barbed wire. Food was standardized. Hygiene was mandatory. Medical attention was immediate. The women were shocked to find clinics stocked with antiseptic and soap, items that had been luxuries in wartime Japan. Some were issued new uniforms, khaki dresses made from surplus American cloth. They were given toothbrushes, sanitary supplies, and soap stamped with the word Lifebuoy. It was soap that would later define many of their memories. Several recalled in post-war interviews that they couldn't believe it was real, that something as simple as washing freely could exist under American control. For them, every shower, every clean towel, every hot meal challenged years of indoctrination. Still, the transition was not immediate. For weeks, the women refused to speak to guards, covering their faces whenever men approached. They expected humiliation. Instead, they were treated with a kind of detached professionalism, not kindness but civility. To American guards, this was procedural discipline. To the Japanese women, it was unthinkable mercy. Within a month, Rumors began spreading among captives that American prison camps were paradises compared to the starvation and brutality of imperial facilities back home. It wasn't exaggeration. It was survival speaking. Food rations included rice, bread, coffee, and occasionally fruit or chocolate. They could write censored letters home. They were allowed to walk under supervision, attend English lessons, and even sew or paint in their off hours. But beneath the calm surface, another layer of complexity existed, one that reflected the psychological shock of the defeated. The women struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they'd been taught. For the first time, the enemy looked human, disciplined, orderly, even compassionate. The same hands that had bombed Tokyo now offered bandages and bread. It was a contradiction that haunted them for years, and as news of Japan's surrender spread through the camps, that contradiction would deepen, forcing both captives and captors to question everything they thought they understood about victory. Defeat and humanity itself. Context, background. Section 2, approx. 750 words. By late August 1945, the war had officially ended, but for the thousands of Japanese prisoners scattered across the Pacific, the conflict lingered inside barbed wire and memory. Most of the captured women were transferred from frontline holding areas to larger, more structured camps operated under U.S. command. Among the most well-documented were facilities on Guam, the Philippines, and later in Hawaii. Each was designed not merely for detention, but for controlled reconstruction, a place where the U.S. could demonstrate the moral contrast between Allied conduct and Axis brutality. It wasn't about kindness. It was about optics and order. American intelligence officers quickly recognized the propaganda potential of humane treatment. If Japanese POWs returned home alive and unbroken, carrying stories of fair treatment, it could erode Japan's militarist myths faster than any leaflet. The Office of War Information, OWI, encouraged clean, structured camps not out of sentimentality, but strategy. Yet within that framework, humanity still surfaced, quietly, almost reluctantly. One of the earliest reports from Guam's POW command noted that the captured Japanese women were exceptionally disciplined, polite, and reserved. They refused to eat until all others were served. They folded their bedding with geometric precision. When offered soap and hot water, they hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. Their captors didn't understand the hesitation. They didn't realize the word shower had been twisted by years of whispered atrocities from German-occupied Europe. But then, the reality of American camps began to unfold before them. The barracks were clean. Meals came at regular hours. Medical staff checked on them daily. No one screamed. No one beat them. Instead, guards stood silently watching, maintaining routine. There were strict rules, Mao, but they were written, not arbitrary. That simple fact stunned the Japanese women more than anything else. In an empire built on unquestioned obedience, written rights didn't exist for prisoners. Here they did. Gradually, the fear cracked. In letters later intercepted by U.S. censors, one Japanese nurse wrote, "The Americans live with rules and fairness. They do not shout. They do not hit. We are treated like humans. It feels like a dream." Another female clerk, captured on Saipan, described her disbelief at seeing American soldiers wash their hands before meals, saying, "Their cleanliness is not only in their bodies, but in their minds." These testimonies weren't exaggerations. For women who had lived through the rationed, disease-ridden conditions of wartime Japan, where soap and rice were rationed and medicine almost non-existent, even a bar of soap symbolized a kind of moral order. In the eyes of their captors, it was simply standard procedure. In the eyes of the captured, it was civilization. Inside the camps, a quiet cultural exchange began to take root. Japanese women taught origami and calligraphy. American guards introduced baseball and coffee. Some women even took up English lessons from camp chaplains who doubled as language instructors. There were no friendships, not in the sentimental sense. But there was recognition, a shared acknowledgement that the war had exhausted both sides. The guards had lost comrades in the Pacific. The women had lost brothers, husbands, and fathers. Beneath the uniforms and languages, grief was universal. By winter 1945, as Reconstruction policies took shape under General Douglas MacArthur's command in Tokyo, POW treatment became a diplomatic tool. The humane reputation of American camps directly supported the U.S. occupation's narrative that democracy and order could replace imperial cruelty. But for the women still behind barbed wire, the experience was more personal. The camp had become, in their own words, a paradox. They were prisoners, yet safer than they had been in Japan's collapsing empire. They were surrounded by soldiers, yet untouched. They were defeated, yet for the first time, treated as individuals. When Japanese newspapers later published accounts of returning female POWs describing American detention as paradise-like, it shocked the nation. Censors in early occupation Japan even tried to suppress such reports, fearing they might undermine the myth of national victimhood, but the truth was undeniable. For many of these women, the camp was the first place they had eaten 3 meals a day, the first time they had medical care without hierarchy, the first time they had soap without scarcity. This quiet irony that captivity, under the enemy, provided more dignity than service to their own empire, became one of the most understated yet profound reversals in modern military history. It set the stage for a larger reckoning, one that went beyond survival or surrender. It forced an entire generation to question what honor, loyalty, and humanity truly meant after total war. And as 1946 began, the world outside the fences was changing fast, rebuilding, rethinking, rewriting what it meant to be civilized. Inside those camps, so were the women who once believed the enemy had no soul. The human contrast, discipline meets compassion. The first shock for the captured women wasn't the food or the safety. It was the discipline, but not the kind they knew. In Imperial Japan, discipline meant endurance, silence, and unquestioning obedience. Here it meant structure, balanced with respect. Every morning, the American guards conducted roll call at the same hour, rain or shine. Orders were delivered firmly but never violently. The prisoners, conditioned to expect humiliation, responded with instinctive precision, standing straight, eyes forward. Yet when they faltered, no blow came. Instead, a guard would quietly repeat the order. That simple absence of cruelty hit harder than any propaganda leaflet could have. One POW later recalled, "The Americans were strict but fair. They respected their own rules and even toward their enemies. This form of humane order carried psychological weight. The Japanese system had taught them that mercy was weakness, but here mercy functioned as authority. The Americans didn't need to shout. They had control through procedure. It was military professionalism, not domination, that maintained discipline. In the broader war narrative, that difference mattered. Because behind every barbed wire fence, the United States was broadcasting an image. This is how a democracy wages war, without surrendering its moral core. The medical paradox. Healing the enemy within days of arrival, many women were treated for malnutrition, trench infections, and exhaustion. The irony was brutal. They had served the Japanese Army's medical corps, patching up wounded soldiers, often without anesthesia, often without rest. Now it was American medics treating them U.S. Army nurses, some of whom had lost brothers in the Pacific, dressed wounds, distributed vitamins, and even vaccinated prisoners against diseases spreading across the tropics. The Red Cross monitored these camps under Geneva Convention guidelines, and reports consistently noted the remarkable health recovery among Japanese female detainees. The women didn't understand why their captors would heal them. They asked questions through interpreters. Why waste medicine on enemies? The answer was always the same: because you're human. That simple moral line fractured years of indoctrination. These women had been trained to believe capture equaled shame, that to fall into enemy hands was dishonor worse than death. Yet here, American doctors preserved their lives without expecting gratitude or compliance. In private notes, one U.S. Army nurse wrote, "They thank us quietly. Some cry when we give them clean bandages. You can see in their faces, they never expected to be cared for." To the Americans, it was procedure. To the Japanese women, it was spiritual shock therapy. It dismantled the myth of the merciless enemy and replaced it with something far more destabilizing: empathy, cultural reversal, learning humanity. Through captivity, for many Japanese POWs, particularly the women. Captivity became their first sustained exposure to Western values and to the concept of individual dignity. Inside the camps, American officers enforced a routine that blended discipline with limited autonomy. Prisoners could organize activities, maintain gardens, and request supplies through formal channels. To the Americans, it was administrative efficiency. To the Japanese, it was revolutionary. In Japanese wartime hierarchy, individuality was erased. You were a unit, not a person. Yet in American camps, each detainee was logged, medically assessed, and provided personal rations. The record-keeping was meticulous, not as control, but as recognition. One former POW nurse later told an interviewer during the 1950s, "The Americans recorded my name as if it mattered. I had not heard my name spoken kindly since the war began." That seemingly small act, using names, not numbers, resonated deeply. For the first time, they were acknowledged as women, not instruments of an empire. This realization marked a cultural pivot point. Many returned to Japan after the war carrying an unexpected perspective, that the enemy they were told to fear had, in defeat, behaved with more civility than their own command ever had in victory. The propaganda battlefield, winning hearts. Not just wars, make no mistake. The United States wasn't just being generous. It was being strategic. Every humane act in those camps was another weapon in the psychological war for post-war legitimacy. By 1945, the U.S. understood that winning battles wasn't enough. The next conflict, ideological, political, cultural, would be about narrative. And that narrative required evidence that American democracy, even in war, upheld humanity where fascism had destroyed it. This is why U.S. censors allowed photographs of POW camps to circulate, showing Japanese prisoners healthy, clothed, and calm. It wasn't propaganda in the crude sense. It was a visual statement of moral superiority, and yet for all its calculation, the result was genuine transformation. One of the camp administrators later wrote, "We didn't set out to convert them, but we did. They saw that order doesn't need cruelty, power doesn't need fear." For the Japanese women, that realization became life-altering. Their loyalty to a dead empire was replaced not by love for their captors, but by awareness that civilization wasn't measured by conquest, but by conduct. This psychological shift would ripple back into Japan's reconstruction, influencing how post-war society perceived democracy, gender, and human rights, because in the end, the battle for hearts and minds didn't start in Tokyo. It started quietly, behind the fences of those camps. The taste of freedom assumed food as psychological warfare. It wasn't ideology that first broke the barrier between captor and captive. It was food. For women who had rationed boiled rice and bitter roots through the final years of the war, the first American meal was nothing short of surreal. White bread, fresh fruit, coffee with sugar, even meat, a luxury many hadn't seen in years. They approached the trays cautiously, expecting trickery or humiliation. But when the guard simply nodded and moved on, they began to eat. The reaction was instinctive, silence, then quiet tears. To the Americans, it was routine nourishment. To the Japanese women, it was psychological disarmament. Meals became a symbol of the strange new order, one where dignity and survival weren't mutually exclusive. Food in this sense became diplomacy. Every plate of mashed potatoes and canned peaches was a message. This is what civilization looks like when it's not at war with itself. Red Cross inspectors later noted that the nutritional standards of American POW camps far exceeded international requirements. Japanese propaganda had painted U.S. soldiers as barbarians, yet here they were, feeding their enemies better than Japan fed its own troops. And in that simple act of feeding the defeated, America gained something far more valuable than compliance. It gained moral ground, the psychological unraveling. When loyalty collided with reality, the greatest battle inside those camps wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought within the minds of the prisoners. Japanese indoctrination had drilled one absolute: never surrender. Death before capture. Yet these women were living proof of survival through surrender. That contradiction tore at their sense of identity. Some refused to speak for weeks. Others performed chores with ritual precision, as if still serving the emperor through invisible duty. But as days turned into months, something shifted. The constant absence of punishment began to erode fear. Psychologists attached to the U.S. Army's POW administration observed this phenomenon closely. They reported what they called moral inversion, when captives begin questioning the ethical foundation of their own regime after prolonged exposure to humane treatment. It wasn't immediate, but it was profound. When American chaplains visited offering reading materials or simply conversation, some women broke down, not from physical pain but from cognitive collapse. Their worldviews were imploding. They had been told Americans were monsters, soulless, violent, godless. Yet here they were, cared for, protected, even allowed to write letters home. One POW nurse later said, "It was easier to believe propaganda than to accept kindness. Kindness made us question everything." In that sense, America's most powerful weapon wasn't the atomic bomb. It was moral consistency, an unexpected, quiet victory of psychology over fear. The forgotten testimony, women who redefined defeat after the war. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, these female POWs returned home, but not unchanged. Their testimony clashed with the national narrative. In a defeated, humiliated nation, no one wanted to hear that the enemy had treated its captives with decency. It was inconvenient truth. Many remained silent for decades, but among post-war sociologists and historians, fragments of their accounts began to surface, in interviews, Red Cross records, and letters stored in archives. One described how she saw a guard help an elderly prisoner carry laundry. Another recalled an American nurse teaching her to pronounce coffee correctly. Small gestures, but historically significant. Because these women embodied something rare, they were both victims and witnesses. They had seen both sides of war, and the contrast reshaped their understanding of what civilization meant. When interviewed years later, a former Japanese auxiliary worker said simply, "They captured our bodies, but freed our minds." Her words, stripped of bitterness, captured the larger truth. The United States had achieved something Imperial Japan never did. It conquered without hatred. It rebuilt without cruelty. It created believers not in a flag, but in a principle that humanity, when unbroken by ideology, can outlive even war itself. The stage was set for a profound turning point, not on the battlefield, but within the fences of these quiet camps, where the moral architecture of post-war relations was already being written. The turning point, paradise behind barbed wire. By mid-1945, the Pacific War was in its final feral phase. Cities burned nightly under B-29 firebombing. Japan's military command was fracturing under the weight of its own propaganda. And yet, inside several American-run POW compounds, Japanese female prisoners were waking to birdsong, clean uniforms, and breakfast. The paradox was complete. Reports from camps in the Philippines and Hawaii paint a scene almost cinematic in its contradiction. Women sweeping walkways while American medics checked their pulse rates. Red Cross trucks unloading supplies next to U.S. guards who offered cigarettes, not commands. These were not acts of mercy alone. They were strategic optics. Washington understood that every humane photograph, every inspection report, was a data point in the global perception war. America wanted to win hearts as decisively as it won territory. Still, for the prisoners themselves, this was no political theater. It was a psychological detonation. A former Imperial nurse, identified in declassified files only as Subject K-17, wrote that her first true panic attack came after her rescue. "They were too kind," she noted. "It made me realize what we had become." Her statement echoed across other testimonies. Guilt, more than hunger, was the dominant pain. The Americans kept records meticulously. Names, inoculations, dietary rations, everything was logged. The Japanese women noticed. In their previous world, accountability was vertical. Orders from above unquestioned, often unrecorded. In this new environment, accountability was horizontal, procedural, bureaucratic, transparent. It was alien yet efficient. One interpreter later recalled watching a group of Japanese orderlies debate whether to bow to an American officer after he thanked them for assisting in a medical drill. "They froze," he said, because hierarchy had dissolved. Respect was now mutual, not demanded. That single moment encapsulated the ideological collapse that no bombing campaign could achieve. The broadcast of compassion. When Allied correspondents arrived at one such camp in Luzon, they expected bitterness or fear. Instead, they found laughter, hesitant but genuine. Women mending uniforms beside U.S. nurses. A volleyball net strung between two guard towers. The photographs from that visit went viral in post-war terms, printed across life and time, broadcast over armed forces radio. The images undermined years of Axis propaganda in a single weekend. Tokyo, still reeling from the atomic bombings, couldn't reconcile what it saw. American captors humanized, Japanese prisoners dignified. The Imperial Information Bureau tried to suppress the reports, calling them enemy fabrications, but the truth had slipped through. Those visuals were more powerful than any leaflet drop. They portrayed an America not only victorious but righteous, capable of mercy and conquest. Inside the camps, however, the reality was more complex. Not all interactions were gentle. There were tensions, language barriers, emotional collapses. Some guards resented the empathy they were ordered to display. Some prisoners weaponized politeness as defiance. But the larger pattern held: systemic discipline built on humane procedure. Even General MacArthur's post-war directives reflected this ethos. The treatment of Japanese nationals, one memo stated, will set the tone of our reconstruction. The military wasn't just defeating an army, it was designing a future ally. The moment of realization, in late August 1945, as Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, news reached the POW camps. The women gathered silently around the bulletin boards. Some cried. Some saluted. Others simply stared. One American officer noted, "They didn't look defeated, they looked unshackled." For the first time, these women understood that surrender didn't always mean shame. For them, captivity had become an education, a hard, undeniable lesson that the enemy they had been taught to despise had shown them the fundamentals of modern civilization. Order, dignity, structure, fairness. It was not paradise. It was disillusionment wrapped in kindness, but it was transformative. The emotional temperature inside those camps now mirrored the global shift outside. The war was over, but the meaning of victory was changing. Paradise, redefined, the myth of American cruelty, fed to Japanese citizens for years through tightly controlled broadcasts, collapsed not through speeches, but through soup kitchens and sewing needles. By September 1945, U.S. military intelligence had authorized open documentation of POW welfare. The strategy was deliberate to weaponize decency. Reports sent to Washington described camps that ran like small disciplined towns. Prisoners worked in rotation, cooked, cleaned, and even taught English to one another. There were rules, yes, but there was also rhythm, an ordinary life re-emerging from chaos. For the Japanese women inside, this order was staggering. They had seen the empire's divine order, rigid, punishing, hierarchical. But here, even discipline had compassion built in. Guards smiled. Nurses asked about sleep. Food was distributed by portion, not rank. A memo from a camp supervisor in Texas noted, "They keep thanking us for boiled rice and hot tea. We forget sometimes that kindness is a shock to those who've lived under fear." The camp's design mirrored a small American suburb. Gardens, barracks with curtains, a small chapel, even a makeshift schoolroom where female clerks were taught basic accounting and English phrases. For some, this was the first time they had written without censorship. Slowly, the phrase "paradise on earth" began to circulate, not as propaganda, but as whispered confession. One Japanese stenographer told a visiting Red Cross officer, "I never thought America would teach me how to be human again." Her words would later appear in an occupation-era pamphlet distributed in Tokyo, part of an effort to reshape public perception of the U.S. The irony was sharp. American propaganda didn't need to invent a myth. Reality had done the job. Strategic humanity. From the Pentagon's perspective, these camps were experiments in controlled empathy. The U.S. military's psychological warfare branch studied the reactions of the female POWs meticulously. They wanted to know how cultural indoctrination could be reversed without violence. The results were striking. Compliance rose when prisoners were given autonomy. Cooperation increased when respect was reciprocated. Even productivity within labor units assisting in logistics and medical duties improved drastically. For policymakers, this wasn't just a moral victory. It was data. Data that would later inform the Marshall Plan's human relations protocols and even Cold War reconstruction policies in Asia. But on the ground, it was less about policy and more about the reawakening of identity. The Japanese women, nurses, clerks, translators began to write again. They painted, sang, laughed. One camp in Arkansas reported that during Christmas 1945, Japanese prisoners performed a bilingual choir rendition of Silent Night. U.S. officers stood in the back, silent, visibly moved. A guard's diary captured the moment. For a second, there were no sides, just people breathing the same winter air. That moment was more powerful than any peace treaty. The collapse of the old world back in Tokyo, the war crime tribunals were beginning. News from the POW camps trickled home through letters and censored cables. Families who had been told their daughters were dead or dishonored suddenly learned they were alive and cared for by the enemy. This revelation destabilized Japan's moral narrative. If the Americans were monsters, then why were their daughters writing about music, soap, and fair rations? If surrender meant dishonor, why did those who surrendered seem more alive than those who fought to the end? The answer was uncomfortable. The propaganda empire had imploded. Within months, the surviving female POWs were repatriated. When they stepped off U.S. transport ships onto Japanese soil, reporters were waiting. They bowed to no banners, no generals, only to their families. Their clothes were American-issued. Their mannerisms had softened. A Tokyo journalist noted, "They looked healthier than our civilians." They smiled. It was confusing. These women became inadvertent ambassadors of American Reconstruction, living proof that the war's moral battlefield had shifted. The empire had fallen not just to bombs, but to the unbearable contrast between cruelty and compassion. The Paradise on Earth label was never official. It was whispered, passed from one survivor to another, spreading like rumor across a broken nation. But the meaning was clear. The Americans had won not just by force of arms, but by force of humanity. And now, in the ashes of surrender, that victory was about to reshape the very foundation of Japan's rebirth. The return home by early 1946, ships bound for Japan carried not soldiers, but survivors, women who had seen both the empire's delusion and America's restraint. When the Japanese female POWs disembarked at Yokohama and Kure, they were greeted not with honor, but with suspicion. To the battered public, they represented surrender, the ultimate shame. They were interrogated by occupation authorities and Japanese bureaucrats alike, questioned about their treatment by the enemy. Most stayed silent. Others answered carefully, aware that the truth would sound like betrayal, but the facts spoke louder than ideology. They were healthy, well-fed, no scars, no signs of abuse. Their hair had been trimmed neatly. Their clothes, clean American-stitched khaki or cotton. This was not how defeated prisoners were supposed to look. Word spread quickly. Whispers circulated through the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka. The Americans treated their captives better than we treated our own soldiers. That comparison hit Japan's remaining military loyalists like a blade. The psychological shock post-war. Japan was a nation in denial, still digesting the magnitude of its defeat. For years, the imperial propaganda machine had painted Allied soldiers as beasts, predators who would defile any captive, especially women. Now eyewitnesses stood before them, contradicting that narrative with calm precision. Some newspapers, under U.S. supervision, cautiously printed stories of humane detainment. Others suppressed them, fearing mass disillusionment with the imperial legacy. But inside American intelligence offices, the data was invaluable. Reports from the female camps were analyzed by the Office of War Information, OWI, and the Psychological Warfare Division. They recognized a powerful truth. Kindness had strategic weight. A captured ideology could not be bombed out of existence, but it could be outshone by moral contrast. These returning women became silent proof of that principle. Their testimonies undermined decades of militarist indoctrination more effectively than any leaflet drop or broadcast. Shifting narratives. Meanwhile, Back in the United States, newspapers quietly celebrated what the War Department called model POW management. No fanfare, no headlines, just a simple acknowledgement that America had handled its captives with discipline and dignity. It wasn't altruism, it was strategy. The United States understood that the way it treated its prisoners would become part of the post-war story. And in a war fought as much for ideology as for territory, image was everything. The female POW camps, segregated, clean, and structured, became a blueprint for post-war rehabilitation methods used later in Korea and even Vietnam. The experiment had proven its worth: order without brutality, control without dehumanization. And yet for the women who lived it, the legacy was deeply personal. They had entered the camps as servants of an empire and left as witnesses to a different kind of power. The world they returned to was not ready for their truth. But history was, and in time their existence would become a quiet, enduring reminder that even in total war, the victor's greatest weapon is restraint, the long silence. For decades after the war, few of the women spoke publicly. Japan's social code treated female prisoners not as survivors, but as tarnished. To have been captured was a mark of dishonor. To admit humane treatment by the enemy was worse. Many blended back into civilian life quietly, marrying, working, or fading into the anonymity of the rebuilding years. Their names were never printed in history books. Their photographs, if any existed, were left in private drawers. Only in the 1970s did fragments of their stories begin resurfacing through oral histories, academic research, and the archives of the U.S. National Archives and Red Cross reports. Scholars noticed a stark difference between Japanese propaganda's version of captivity and the lived experiences of those women. They didn't find brutality. They found structure, medical care, and even dignity, administered by American soldiers barely older than themselves. A moral contrast. The Japanese Army's own record on POWs was damning. From the Burma Railway to the Philippines, Allied captives suffered starvation, forced labor, and executions. By comparison, the Americans' adherence to the Geneva Convention looked not just lawful, but moral. This contrast wasn't lost on historians. By the 1980s, Japan's wartime conduct had become a central debate in academic and diplomatic circles. The testimonies of Japanese POWs held in American custody, particularly the women, played a critical role in reshaping the post-war image of both nations. They demonstrated that America's victory was not only military but ethical. Even in captivity, the enemy had been treated as human beings, something Imperial Japan had denied its own captives. And in a deeper sense, this ethical victory carried long-term geopolitical value. It laid the moral groundwork for Japan's eventual alliance with the United States, built not on fear, but on respect. Echoes in modern warfare. Military scholars studying POW psychology cite these camps as the foundation for what would later become known as hearts and minds strategy. The theory, humane treatment disarms ideology faster than coercion ever could. The experiment, born unintentionally in those quiet Texas and California camps, set the precedent for post-war U.S. occupation policy, how to turn enemies into partners. America had proven that moral authority could be weaponized with precision. Legacy of paradise. In later interviews, one former prisoner reportedly said, "I saw America through that fence, and what I saw changed me." Her statement wasn't political, it was human. To her, paradise didn't mean luxury or comfort. It meant being treated with dignity in a world that had forgotten it. For historians, that perspective reframed how captivity, mercy, and victory could coexist. For the women who lived it, it was proof that compassion, when shown at the height of hatred, leaves the deepest mark. The war had ended. The camps were dismantled. But the moral lesson remained engraved in history's gray film reels. True power isn't in the hands that command armies. It's in the hands that choose not to harm the defeated. The story of the Japanese women held in American POW camps isn't one of spectacle or strategy. It's one of quiet revelation. They entered captivity expecting cruelty and discovered restraint. They had been told that the Americans were monsters, that surrender meant humiliation or death. Instead, they encountered a system bound by rules, ethics, and a sense of humanity that transcended vengeance. For the U.S. Army, it wasn't charity. It was discipline, an operational embodiment of the Geneva Convention, executed with military precision. Even in victory, America had to demonstrate it could win without becoming what it fought against. That restraint, documented, verifiable, and consistent, became one of the most underrated weapons of the Allied campaign. It was psychological warfare at its highest level, breaking the enemy's ideology not through torture, but through decency for the women who lived through it. The experience planted seeds that would bloom quietly in Japan's post-war reconstruction. Some became translators, teachers, or advocates for cultural exchange. Others carried their memories silently, but they carried them as proof that the world outside Japan's wartime propaganda was more complex, more human, and far less hateful. History often celebrates the victors for the battles they win, but true victory, as these camps revealed, lies in how one treats the defeated. The phrase paradise on earth wasn't about luxury. It was about peace, about being seen as human again after years of total war. In the black and white photos that remain, tents, fences, soldiers, and faces half lit by the sun, you can almost feel the uneasy calm of a world trying to remember its conscience. Because amid the ashes of the Pacific War, where millions died for empire and pride, a few thousand women discovered something rare, that mercy, even in uniform, could rewrite an enemy's heart more effectively than any victory parade. And that is what made America's war not just one of steel and fire, but one of moral power.